not really sure how to live my life.
All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. If everyone can find their seats. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is What Happened to the World's Forests in 2022. My name is Michaela Weiss. I'm the Director of Global Forest Watch, and today we are presenting the 2022 tree cover loss data. So just a few housekeeping points before we get started. As with the other sessions, our session is being interpreted, so you can find that through the app. For those of you online, also we have interpretation there as well. And at the end, we are going to have a time for your questions. So we'll show this slide again when we get to that point, but just so you know that you can use Slido to ask questions throughout the event. So we have a great lineup for you today. We're going to present a bit of the findings, again, showcase what we're seeing in certain countries across the tropics and around the world. And we're also going to have a panel discussion to hear a little bit more about what the data means across the tropics. But first, to kick us off, I'm going to introduce Andrew Steer to welcome us and kick us off. And Andrew Steer is the president and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. Can you hear me? I'm not sure. Could we turn this one on?
There's some others on the stage. I have a mic. There's a few more that are on the stage there.
How about this one? Good. Well done. It's so good to see you here because what we are about to see is something really remarkable on several levels with huge implications. You think about it 20 years ago, when you wanted to know what was going on in the forest, you had to wait till governments did a whole lot of analysis and wrote reports and sent it to FAO or somebody else, and then they manipulated it, wrote a report that was 600 pages long or whatever, and it was very professionally done, but my goodness me, it took a long time, and we weren't sure that it was so accurate. And since Michaela, you and Matt Hansen, if he's here, University of Maryland, since the wonderful NICV came in and started financing this, since 2015 to now, the quality of this data has improved hugely. I've been influenced by my wife because she works on education. SDG 4 is all about education. And she comes and looks at the data on forests, and she is mesmerized. And I've heard her give several speeches which says, you know, my husband works on issues of nature and climate, and do you know they can see almost every tree that falls in the world? And we have no idea how many children are falling out of school. The quality of data that we now have on forests is better than exists in most of the other sustainable development goals. And I would like to give tribute to people in this room that has made that happen. And the great thing is we're just getting going. It's going to get better and better. And the quality of data this year is better than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And the quality of data 5 years from now is going to be different. And so now, for the first time, when 140 countries commit to move towards net zero deforestation by 2030, we can actually know whether or not each and every one is on track. I mentioned this morning that last week, you know, President Macron and other leaders are extremely exercised about the issue of forests. And we now can tell them country by country what's happening, and that helps us engage even more. Last week, talking with the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is really trying to do their very best, the person in charge was saying we really need more data on what's happening to our forests. And I said, yes, that's true, but actually you have quite a lot of data already, and we know enough to act, and that's why we're having this conversation. So I simply want to give tribute to everybody, to WRI, to the University of Maryland, to the many other players here who are providing all kinds of services, to NICFI, who's helping to finance it, we're now going to hear these remarkable new data. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. So, just this morning, we launched the findings of the 2022 tree cover loss data, which is produced annually by the University of Maryland. This data has been operational for almost a decade now, and a lot of its power has been in the fact that it is so consistent and updated reliably every year. So as Crystal talked about this morning, that operationalization of the data has been key. And as Andrew mentioned, thanks in big part to many of our funders, and especially NICFI, who have really believed in the power of this data to illuminate the world on the state of our forests. So the data is global, but today we're going to be focusing mainly on the loss of tropical forests and primary tropical forests in particular. And that's because almost all deforestation or human-caused permanent change in forest cover is happening within the tropics. Tropical primary forests in particular are some of our most important ecosystems to protect in order to avoid biodiversity loss and carbon emissions. So what does the data show for 2022? The world lost 4.1 million hectares of tropical primary forest in 2022, an area the size of Switzerland and the rate equivalent to 11 football fields per minute. I said this morning as well, that was also resulted in 2.7 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions, equivalent to the annual fossil fuel emissions of India. And this is all coming despite the fact that 145 countries committed to end deforestation by 2030 as part of the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use. So we are rapidly losing one of our best tools to combat climate change, to protect biodiversity, and to support the health and livelihoods of millions of people. And we are running out of time to turn things around. So I'm now going to turn over to my colleague, Liz Goldman, to describe what we are seeing in key countries around the world. Liz is the Senior Research Manager with Global Forest Watch at the World Resources Institute. So welcome, Liz.
Great, thanks, Michaela. So let's dig into some of the country findings, starting with Brazil and South America. So Brazil had 43% of total primary forest loss across the tropics in 2022. Primary forest loss increased by 15% between 2021 and 2022, and non-fire primary forest loss, which in Brazil is mostly associated with deforestation, hit its highest level since 2005. The 2022 data coincides with the last year of the Bolsonaro administration, which saw weakened regulations and enforcement around deforestation. But President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, took office the first day of 2023 and has promised to end deforestation in the Amazon and other biomes by 2030. The primary forest loss is especially accelerating in the western Amazon, and as we can see in the map here, which shows statistically significant hotspots of primary forest loss, the loss in Brazil is concentrated around existing road networks and highways, and mainly consists of larger patches or clearings that are likely for cattle pasture. We also saw a number of incursions into indigenous territories in 2022. Moving to Bolivia, Bolivia saw its highest year on record for primary forest loss in 2022, with a 32% increase from 2021. For the third year running, Bolivia was third for most primary tropical forest loss, falling behind only Brazil and DRC. And commodity agriculture is the main driver of loss in Bolivia, mostly for soybean production. Fires were also responsible for around a third of the primary forest loss in 2022. Fires in Bolivia are almost always started to clear land for agricultural production, and this year they spread out of control due to drought conditions, and those drought conditions themselves are most likely linked to deforestation, as deforestation in the Amazon region disrupts precipitation patterns and can lead to hotter, drier conditions for forests there. Moving to Africa, where loss in the Democratic Republic of Congo remained persistently high in 2022, losing 500,000 hectares of primary forests. Across the Congo Basin, the key drivers of primary forest loss are linked to small-scale agriculture and charcoal production, which is the key form of energy in the region. And reducing primary forest loss just remains a challenge since as poverty in DRC is widespread and access to electricity is limited, which means that much of the population relies on forests to meet their basic needs. So investments to lift people out of poverty are urgently needed to curb deforestation there and to see a decline in the rates in the coming years. Other countries in the region, primary forest loss tends to fluctuate from year to year, but the good news, the positive news, is that Gabon and the Republic of Congo, both high forest, low deforestation countries, continue to have low overall rates of loss. Moving over to West Africa, Ghana experienced the biggest increase in primary forest loss of any country in recent years. Ghana also lost the biggest percentage of its primary forests among all countries in 2022. And while this is concerning because there's few primary forests left in the country, it's also worth recognizing that Ghana's forest loss of 18,000 hectares is quite small compared to some of the other countries we're discussing here today. But still, loss in Ghana appears to be encroaching into protected areas, which are the only tracts of primary forests that are really left in the country, and some of the loss is adjacent to cocoa farm and farms which are most likely related to cocoa production, as well as other patches of loss appear to be linked to fire and gold mining. Moving over to Indonesia, where primary forest loss remained historically low in 2022, Indonesia has reduced its primary forest loss more than any other country in recent years, and both government measures and corporate actions seem to be coming together to have a positive impact for forests there. So some of these government policies include increased fire monitoring and law enforcement efforts, a moratorium on new licenses for logging and oil palm plantations, and a renewed commitment to protect and restore peatlands and mangrove forests. Corporate commitments to end deforestation also appear to be working. Now, over 83% of the palm oil refining capacity is under no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation commitments, and the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil also strengthened their certification requirements in 2018. You'll notice an extra gold bar on the chart this year for 2022. That's there to emphasize some of the differences between how we measure loss and how the government of Indonesia maps their forests. So in a preliminary joint analysis we did together with Indonesia's Ministry of Environment and Forestry, we found that 107,000 hectares of our primary forest data fell within forests that are officially mapped by the government and have a larger patch size, so larger than 2 hectares. Finally, we want to zoom out a bit to talk about total global tree cover loss. So while the other figures we've been talking about today are just on primary forests, this figure includes the loss of primary, secondary, and planted forests. Loss in trees of all canopy cover actually declined by 10% in 2022, but this decrease is a direct result of a reduction in fire-related losses. So non-fire-related losses, the gold bars on the chart, actually increased slightly in 2022 by about 1%. And Russia was the biggest contributor to the global decline in global tree cover loss, with a 34% reduction between 2021 and 2022. And this is largely because 2021 was a record fire season in the country, while the fire season in 2022 was relatively below average. So we just went through a lot of charts, a lot of numbers. The bottom line is that we are continuing to lose forests despite the stated political will and commitments to stop deforestation. And yet another year of data emphasizes the need to move beyond words and signatures to action if we're to see a meaningful decline in the data in the coming years. Thank you.
Just leave it there. All right, thank you, Liz. So you can read our full analysis on the Global Forest Review. The link is here on your screen. And you can also view the data and the statistics on the Global Forest Watch platform. So you have heard some of the highlights from the 2022 tree cover loss data, but where does that leave us? We're going to turn now to a discussion about what this data means in the fight to stop tropical deforestation, We are going to open up to audience questions, as I mentioned earlier, so you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can go to Slido and find our session that way. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Frances Seymour, a distinguished senior fellow for forests at the World Resources Institute, who is going to moderate the discussion, and I'm going to invite her and our panelists also for this next segment to come up on stage.
Okay, so I gotta confess that the Global Forest Watch tree cover loss release is one of my favorite events on the World Resources Institute's annual calendar. On the one hand, I get to work with all of these bright young women that you've seen present and many others who dominate the Global Forest Watch leadership. I get quoted in the New York Times. I get to be on stage like this. And I learned yesterday this is called a Madonna mic, but I promise I'm not going to burst into song, however tempted I am. But on the other hand, I'm ambivalent because the tree cover loss data is stubbornly persistent. It just doesn't go down year after year for the tropical tree cover loss. And despite all our efforts, not only is it not going down, it's actually heading a little up in the wrong direction. And it's hard for me to think of anything new to say, because thanks to the work of all of you, we know what's happening in the forest. Increasingly, we know what's driving what's happening in the forest, either directly or indirectly. And with few exceptions, we pretty much know what interventions would be effective in turning it around. And this year's data, I'd say, are particularly disheartening because in light of the Glasgow commitments that everyone's been referring to, we were hoping that 2022, the first full year after those commitments were made, we might start seeing that signal in the data of bending the curve. Hasn't happened yet. Patience is not my cardinal virtue, but we can try to be patient. So what is it that's holding us back? Is it lack of political will? Is it lack of finance? Is it lack of capacity? I don't know, but our panel is going to be here to help us understand. Another thing I think we want to understand, and something I want to focus on, is reason for optimism. Why might we think that we will be successful in turning it around? Two things that occur to me is, one, new narratives. After Montreal, there's been this resurgence of interest in linking climate and nature. Biodiversity, the non-carbon ways that forests affect the climate. And maybe these things can come together for a new pulse of energy to this agenda. Another reason for optimism, new leadership, important places. Head of state in Brazil, head of the World Bank, maybe that will make a difference. Happily, we've got world-class panelists lined up here and virtually to help us both interpret the data we've just seen presented, but also to look ahead, what to expect, what to look for, and what we collectively as a community need to be doing to really redouble our efforts to turn those numbers around. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Tasso Azevedo, known to many of you and a popular panelist in this event. Tasso is the founder and current coordinator of MAP Biomass, a forest monitoring initiative that's now working in 14 countries. And I'm going to look to Tasso for interpretation of the Brazil numbers in particular. To Tasso's left, we have Sydney Novoa, who is the Director of GIS and Technology for Conservation in Amazonica. His organization also works across the Amazon region. To his left, we have Samuel Ngifo, who is the General Secretary of the Center for Environment and Development in Cameroon. And Samuel works across the Congo Basin region, so we'll look to him for answers to those questions. We also have joining us from Jakarta, by the magic of technology, Belinda Margono, who is the Director of Forest Inventory and Forest Resources Monitoring at the Ministry of Environment and Forests in Indonesia. And I think yes, Belinda, smile and wave. We have you connected. Wonderful. And then at the end of the panel, we've asked Michaela to join us in case there are questions related to the data that's just been presented. So let me turn to you first, Tasso, and ask you about this new leadership question with reference to your country. I know that the new administration just took office in January after the cutoff for the data that was just presented. What signals are you looking for in the data that this is making a difference, and what should we be looking for in the coming year?
Yeah, I think last year was particularly strong in terms of deforestation in Brazil, especially because of the elections, actually, and the expectations. And so the second half of the year, actually, last year, the second half of the year was like tremendous increase on the deforestation. And deforestation grow in all the biomes in Brazil, not just the Amazon, but it grows everywhere, grow everywhere. Now, the signs that we have on the first half of this year is very, I mean, for the Amazon is good signs. So like if you take from January to June this year, the alerts that we have on deforestation, they are now about 40% less than the same period of last year. So signs are getting there. And it's all about expectations. If you set the expectation that you know, all deforestation will count and et cetera, and then you want to go in a certain direction, the players start to think on the consequence. So I think this is the first movement, the commitment that was shown, et cetera. But in the other hand, in the Cerrado, which is not totally accounted on the numbers here, the Cerrado, the deforestation actually increased 40% on the same period. And again, it has to do, we think, with the expectations. When the new legislation there is a lot of discussion of the new legislation in Europe here, and basically 60% of the Cerrado, at least, is not covered by the EU legislation. But that's where 70% of the growth on the commodities is happening. So basically, it's like, okay, the Amazon is a little bit tough now. Let's deviate to some other place. So, yes. So, you know, the strategy to fight deforestation has to cover not just the Amazon, but has to cover all the other biomes. Otherwise, we'll just like decrease in one place, but we'll be increasing in other places.
Great, thank you. I think one of the things we've learned in recent years is that what happens in the forest doesn't stay in the forest. Those of us who live in Washington, D.C., a few weeks ago experienced smoke from Canadian forest fires drifting down into our airspace. Gave me a sore throat, couldn't see across the Potomac River Gorge, and I know that many of you have experienced much worse in the places where you live. And smoke is just one example of things escaping from the forest, whether it's pandemic-inducing viruses, violence from drug trafficking. So we're in a very interconnected world. And I think the fire in particular is one that has shown up increasingly in the data in recent years, those sort of dark red parts of the bars, perhaps signaling an increasing lack of resilience based on overall greenhouse gas warming, but also maybe an artifact of deforestation itself through these non-carbon effects of losing rainfall or cooler temperatures that in turn feed a cycle of fire. And I mention that as a prelude to my first question to Sydney, because I'm going to ask him to talk a bit about Bolivia, where Bolivia has jumped up to third place in the league tables, and the bars of the amount of forest loss accounted for by fire are quite significant. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us what's been going on in Bolivia, how you see the drivers, whether it's the decreased resilience, directly, indirectly from climate change, deforestation, other drivers, and what might be ahead?
Great. Well, first, thank you, Francis, and also thank you for the organizers of this event for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of this panel. And I want to start apologizing with my colleagues from Bolivia present in the audience. I'm Peruvian, that I'm going to give you an opinion about Bolivia, but before to come here, I had an interesting discussions with some colleagues from the Bolivian government and NGOs about what happened in 2022, probably the worst year in terms of deforestation annual rates in Bolivia. So Bolivia has experienced very dramatic changes due to the socioeconomic and climate factors, no? And also we have to add the pandemic, no? During 2022, most of my colleagues agreed that Bolivia had economic reactivation, after the COVID-19. And this reactivation generate the expansion of these two main deforestation drivers that today morning Dr. Hansen show in a very didactic way. Both drivers are the agriculture, both slash and burn, and of course agro-industry, especially for soybean, and the other deforestation driver that I call it as the elephant in the room, the expansion of cattle for livestock. To understand the effect of soybean, according these data sets from University of Maryland about commodities, Bolivia has more than 900,000 hectares of soybean crops. No? Just in the last 5 years, they deforested the 11% of this total surface in Bolivia. And in that sense, the Mennonite colonies played an important, a key role. They administrate about 30% of the total country soybean surface, and they deforested also the 30% in the last 5 years. No? In 2022, the deforestation was concentrated, especially in Santa Cruz department. No, they are some data sets and information that allow us to conclude that in the northern part of the department, especially in the border with Beni region, continued the increasing of soybean frontier, while in the center of Santa Cruz was the expansion of livestock. No? And well, in terms of what are going to happen maybe in the future, it is a little bit hard, to predict if Bolivia will keep, this trend in terms of deforestation rates, because right now is experiencing a contraction, a slowdown of its economy, with a potential devaluation of the currency, and that can produce both two scenarios. No, the reduction of the agro-industry expansion because of these economic issues, but on the other hand, there is a risk of the emerging small scale areas that could be more difficult to control and to stop.
So while you're holding the mic, Sydney, I would want to ask you just 1 minute each. Tell us what's going on in Peru and in Colombia. That data was not presented in the presentation, but I'm sure people are wondering, is it similar to what's going on in Bolivia and Brazil, or completely different, or what's up there?
Sure. Well, for Peru and Colombia, according to these new data sets, we can conclude that they keep almost the same annual rates in terms of, well, in Peru at least, has experienced a small increase between 6 and 5% compared to 2021. Colombia, on the other hand, reduced its deforestation in just 2%, no? But in both countries, the hotspots of deforestation are almost the same. In Peru, are linked with the two main highways that cross the country in the center and also in the southern part. And in Colombia, it also keeps in the arc of deforestation in the departments of Guaviare, Meta, and Caquetá.
Thanks. So now let's turn to the Congo Basin, which is, of course, a very different situation than we've been talking about in Latin America, and ask Samuel to, tell us why is this stubborn persistence of deforestation there? Lack of political will, lack of finance, lack of capacity, something else? And if we needed to solve this problem, what do you do tomorrow?
Thank you. It's very obviously not a lack of knowledge. A very long time ago when I started working on forestry, I'm a lawyer by training, so I had to rely on scientists. And every scientist I met asking for the consequences of this or that activity on the forest will tell me we don't have enough data to conclude. We can't say if it's bad for the forest or not. So I think this prevented some of the right decisions to be made back then. Today, I think nobody has that excuse anymore. It's very easy to know what is going on, and it's really easy to know what are the consequences. We can conclude. Even a non-scientist like me can conclude. So what's the problem? When I look at the map, I had the feeling that since 2010, the deforestation trend has not changed. And my fear is that now it's likely to change, but not in the right way. There are some few reasons why I could be pessimistic. First reason, many of the countries, well, not many, all the countries in the Congo Basin rely on imports for their food supply. So with the war in Ukraine, they have been suffering a lot because of the increase in the prices, leading all the governments to be a bit more aggressive in a policy, well, incentivizing local production of food. So if tomorrow we try to locally produce all what we eat, that will have a lot of consequences on the size of land that we need to clear to be able to produce what we need. This is the first reason to be a bit pessimistic. The second reason is population increase, normal population increase. The third reason, we have been looking at the map of the mineral reserves. And all through the Congo Basin, more than 1/3 of the forest is potentially covered by mining deposit and could be very easily cleared for mining, including energy transition minerals. So this is something to be monitored very closely. And to be frank, I don't know how we will be able to get out of such a trap. And we also have a lot of an increasing demand for large-scale agricultural land. So these are the reasons to be pessimistic, reasons why I think in the future the figures could be different. But at the same time, I think if we were all pessimistic, we'll not be here, right? So I think producing data and making a very clear case of what is going on could be a very good way to push some of our governments towards increasing productivity and reducing the size of land that we need. If you look at the palm oil industry, for example, large companies sometimes have the same yield per hectare than small farmers with no technique, no finances. So this can be easily changed if the government says, we increase your taxes according to the size of land you are using. If you don't increase productivity, we increase your taxes or we don't give you, but there are many possibilities. And that could work also for many other crops that we are planning to grow. The second thing that could be done is using the market as a tool to regulate deforestation in Central Africa. The EU and the UK are already doing so, and we really hope to see more and more markets going through that direction. And saying we will not welcome products coming from deforestation. Again, this will push us to work on the existing deforested land and increase the yields on those lands. This will need more knowledge, but not on forest, on agriculture. And I think this could be provided. And the second, and I will end here, is about what you said about DRC. Deforestation there seems to be the result of small-scale farming and charcoal production. And as you rightly said, it is the result of poverty, basically. So if you want to reduce that deforestation trend, I think it's not acting on the forest, but it's acting on the poverty. Acting on the poverty side will have an impact on the forest. Providing electricity, access to better energy could help. And the government will not do that because they don't have the means for doing that.
Well, I appreciate your balancing your pessimistic outlook with some specific things we can do to address the issues. Now I want to keep Belinda from having to stay up too late in Jakarta and turn to her and shift to a more optimistic picture. Belinda, and I think everybody knows, the last 5 years, Indonesia has done an amazing job of just this relentless downward slope in the deforestation numbers, and it's something that's a cause for global celebration. And I guess, especially in light of your privileged view of what's going on from the Ministry of Environment and Forest, but also your background doing your PhD and postdoc with Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland. You know this data pretty well. So, Indonesia's success has been variously attributed to, government action, to voluntary corporate commitments to get deforestation out of commodity supply chains, to favorable weather. And I just wonder how it looks like, from where you sit and what the data is telling you about how to explain this remarkable success story and what's the outlook for the future. Okay, we need much higher volume, I think. Try again.
Okay.
Yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Wonderful.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I will try to answer the Francis' question, but yes, I'm a forester and I'm also a geographer. Used to work with Matt Hansen. I probably would like to give some information related what is actually happening in Indonesia, how we can reduce what we call it deforestation so far. I think deforestation is also one of our concerns so far. So we also have kind of controlling for deforestation, as maybe you aware. It's also mentioned during the presentation of list that I mentioned about the what usually call it moratorium. That was called moratorium, but it's actually now becoming termination of the granting a new license on primary forest and peatland, or used to be called moratorium. So in Indonesian language, we call it a pipit. So that is kind of the area. It's about 66 million hectares. kind of the area that actually cannot be used for any permit for that one. And there is also a strict regulation now that we try to give a restriction on changes the area that covered by forest into other forestry sector. It is not easy because actually the forestry also have give land to other sector, but we try to give restriction. So the land that will be give to other sector should not be forested. And there are also a lot of action related to the forest and land fire management. That is including change the paradigm from suppression into prevention. And the prevention is also including, I also explained to a colleague from WRY, when they visit Indonesia, we have kind of cloud seeding, and that is quite expensive also, but it's worked so far. And also we have to strengthen the monitoring of the fire itself. That is also including the pit management, what we call it the pit water management, and also restoration. Also everything related to the sustainable forest management. And also try to strengthening some of the spatial data in terms of quality, and also an integrated system that we can use it also for monitor our forest. So when we do have the data, that will be much more easier for us to get a lot of information on the data itself. So, and above all, we also have a relationship closely to the climate change because combating climate change is also one of our goal. And beside that, we have also the law enforcement. Even though it's not that easy, but we try to have all the regulation, the strict regulation, that we try to put it back on the in the place that is also covered with the law enforcement that is actually happening on the ground with the tight supervision and also stronger regulation. So that is, I think I can give you information regarding what's happening to Indonesia. But if you allow me, I probably also, as a forester, I think the terminology or the word that we use for the global, like the primary forest, is not something that how we call it as a forester. So maybe sometimes it creates a lot of disinformation in the case of the forester. So probably maybe we can do some better conversation and how to call what now it is called it as the primary forest at the global scale.
Thank you, Belinda. And in fact, you anticipated my second question about how you use data to actually implement these policies to control deforestation. I appreciate that. You mentioned at the end a focus on law enforcement, and that brings us to the first question that's come in by Slido, and let me encourage you to submit more questions. We have a little bit more time. But Michaela, I'm going to put this one to you. That the question is, would you be able to share how much of the tree cover loss that you presented is due to illegal forest exploitation as opposed to things that are legal within existing national laws?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think there are some ways that we can try to get at that, right, by combining the data with land use information, zoning information to try and get at where things may be happening legally or illegally, but that's one of the, excuse me, one of the weaknesses of the data is that we can see clearly where forests are disappearing, but we can't necessarily say why or what is causing that or what should be happening in those areas. So that's one of the fundamental limitations, I would say.
You want to add on, Tasso?
I just want to comment this. I hope you never try to do it. Because it's very important. Like we do this, analysis of one by one the deforestation in Brazil for the last 4 years. And one thing that we learn is that we never say something is legal or illegal. We can say there is some evidences of something irregular, but we never say, because that's something that it's not for us, like to say, it's for the government or the regulators and so on. And it's very important for the perception of the data. So I would disencourage to actually try to say that, because this will probably harm the perception of whoever has to use the data. So just kind of kind of a weird.
Samuel, you want to jump in?
Yes, one very quick comment on this. I think this is exactly one of the areas where there is a need to have global data and local data working together to provide, well, the truth somehow. Because with what you have, somebody needs to go there to be able to say what is supposed to happen here. And to conclude, is a legal logging concession or it's a non-allocated area, so it's illegal.
Okay. We're about to run out of time, but there are two more questions that I think need to be put on the table. I said that what happens in the forest doesn't stay in the forest, but maybe what happens in Brussels doesn't stay in Brussels either. And at this summit, there's been a lot of talk about the new EU deforestation regulation. Samuel, you already mentioned the demand-side measures. Do any of you see, or I should put it like this, what kind of impact do you see that regulation having in the regions where you work? Do you want to go first, Samuel? Or?
Yes. I think it's too early to see an impact, but we can foresee from what we see in the practice. We can foresee what is likely to happen. First, we have seen a lot of logging, no, not logging, but agro-industries, large-scale agro-industries, installed without following the proper process. I suspect they will have a lot of problems having their end products on the market here. And this gives us a very good argument for discussion back in Central Africa, saying if you want to be able to sell, and this is the purpose of trying to have access to land, you need to do it properly. You need to respect the regulation. The second issue, more concerning, is the fact that in Central Africa, most of the cocoa producers are small producers, small farmers. And they have been clearing the land. They don't even know about the regulation. So they don't know about December 2020 as being the date when they should not be clearing the forest anymore. So many of them are still clearing and planting and hope to sell their cocoa to somebody who will be selling it in Europe. And I think this will be a problem. This is likely to leave outside of the market tens of thousands of small producers. And I think this is something that we have to work on as quickly as possible.
So I want to jump to the last question since we are running out of time, but this is an issue we could spend the rest of the conference on, and that is the role of indigenous and local communities, both as frontline communities who suffer the impacts of the drivers of tree cover loss, but also have to be main protagonists in any solutions. So one of the questions that came in via Slido, and I'll first turn to Michaela, is with these new data published, has there been any new analysis made related to the tree cover loss inside indigenous lands? But then as a follow-up, and I'll go first to you, Samuel, is, what is it that indigenous and local communities need to be supported in order to play their role as protagonists in protecting the forest? So maybe Michaela, you first.
Yeah, we haven't done yet a comprehensive analysis of the tree cover loss within indigenous territories, but certainly have seen a number of examples where there was incursion in the 2022 data that we can see into those territories. But also earlier this year, WRI put out some analysis looking at the trend over time, essentially, of this tree cover loss data and of the carbon fluxes associated with that, and really found that indigenous territories are some of the best remaining carbon sinks that we have in the Amazon basin.
Great. Samuel?
Different in the Congo Basin in the sense that communities there do not enjoy recognized rights on land and forest. So they can't protect land and forest. People can come in. And this is where we have a very good opportunity in the sense that if communities are supported, they can be involved into restoration. And this could be a way for them to restore the forest and still be able to use the forest, but also to claim property rights, both on the resources that they just created and on the land supporting those resources. To me, this will be the best way to, the best future I see for the Congo Basin. It will help sequestrating the carbon. It will help alleviating poverty, protecting communities' rights, securing peace in many of those countries, and also help the government meeting the 30 by 30 target. Because this will not be done by creating new protected areas. There are already a lot of conflict around protected areas, but through community protected areas that they create and manage, I think this will be possible.
Thank you. Unfortunately, the countdown clock tells me that we're out of time, so we're going to have to close it there. It remains for me to do two things. One is to remind you of what's up on the screen now, and that is the Global Forest Review platform has all the data that's been presented today, as well as the analysis from the Global Forest Watch team, a blog of my own trying to interpret, what it means and where we go from here. I encourage you to follow up and take a look at those resources. Please join me in thanking both the Global Forest Watch team for presenting this data and their partners at University of Maryland and all the members of our panel who've contributed their insight to us today. Thank you.
Thanks, you too.